The television courtroom had never witnessed such callous disaster exploitation disguised as humanitarian aid. Michelle, helping Michelle Rodriguez, founder of Emergency Recovery Solutions and self-proclaimed disaster relief coordinator, stood before America's most feared TV judge with the kind of confident compassion that could only come from years of preying on disaster victims without consequence. Her American Red Cross-style uniform and disaster relief clipboard gleamed as the words that would destroy her predatory empire spilled from her lips. "Judge, you clearly don't understand disaster recovery logistics or the complexities of emergency construction management. Maybe if you knew more about FEMA procedures and storm damage assessment instead of just TV court, you'd see that I provide essential services to families who have lost everything and need immediate professional help." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed into the kind of death stare that had made heartless criminals confess their schemes on national television. But what happened next would leave the entire audience speechless and turn Michelle Rodriguez from compassionate disaster responder into the most hated disaster vulture in America. Michelle had walked into that courtroom believing she was untouchable. After all, she had been running her disaster exploitation operation for 11 years, perfecting the art of preying on catastrophe victims while stealing millions in federal relief funds and private donations meant to help families rebuild their lives. She had built a criminal empire worth millions by systematically exploiting human tragedy, targeting hurricane survivors, wildfire victims, and tornado-devastated communities who trusted her professional appearance and urgent promises of emergency assistance. Today was supposed to be just another easy dismissal. Another chance to convince a judge that disaster victims were unreasonable complainers who didn't understand the complexities of emergency reconstruction work. She had no idea that Judge Judy had spent the previous week making calls to FEMA investigators, reviewing disaster relief records, and uncovering a pattern of fraud so extensive it involved dozens of fake disaster responses and hundreds of stolen relief funds across multiple states. The plaintiff, Robert Chen, sat clutching photographs of his destroyed home in the witness chair, surrounded by folders full of contracts, FEMA documents, and insurance records that told the story of systematic disaster exploitation. 4 months ago, Robert's family had lost everything when Hurricane Maria devastated their Florida community, and Michelle had appeared within hours promising emergency reconstruction services that would help them rebuild their lives with federal assistance and insurance settlements. But Robert had finally discovered the truth about Michelle's operation. He had no idea he was about to witness the most savage exposure of disaster fraud in television history. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her expression grim with the weight of what she was about to reveal. In 35 years of jurisprudence, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect disaster predators, but this case had triggered every alarm bell she possessed. Michelle Rodriguez had walked through her door with all the classic signs: the fake humanitarian concern, the dismissive attitude toward her victim's devastation, the calculated manipulation that blamed everyone except herself for the missing relief funds and incomplete reconstruction work. It all pointed to someone whose crimes went far beyond simple contract disputes into territory that had stolen hope from families who had already lost everything to natural disasters. And Judge Judy's investigation had confirmed her worst suspicions about what this woman had been doing to vulnerable disaster victims for over a decade. Before we dive into this incredible destruction of the most heartless disaster fraudster ever exposed on television, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready to see Judge Judy absolutely annihilate a disaster predator who thought her humanitarian facade would protect her from justice. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these explosive courtroom moments that show what happens when disaster criminals underestimate America's toughest judge. Trust me, what Judge Judy reveals about Michelle's massive disaster exploitation operation will shock you to your core. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension, but different from the usual construction disputes. The audience members, many of whom had experienced natural disasters or understood the vulnerability of families who had lost everything, sensed something uniquely sinister about this woman who claimed to help disaster victims rebuild their lives. Michelle had delivered her opening statement with the practiced authority of someone who had perfected the art of exploiting catastrophic loss while maintaining the facade of a caring emergency responder. Your Honor, disaster recovery is an incredibly complex field that requires immediate response capabilities and extensive knowledge of federal relief procedures. Robert Chen's family experienced devastating losses during Hurricane Maria, and emergency recovery solutions provided critical services during the most challenging period of their lives. When bureaucratic delays and insurance complications affected our reconstruction timeline, he became unreasonable and refused to understand that disaster recovery involves obstacles that separate professional emergency responders from inadequate volunteer efforts. She had spoken with the confident authority of someone who had given similar explanations to FEMA investigators and devastated families for years, describing Robert Chen as an unreasonable disaster victim who didn't appreciate the sophisticated coordination required for professional emergency reconstruction services. Her voice carried just the right amount of humanitarian concern, clearly believing she was dealing with another emotional victim who couldn't appreciate her disaster relief expertise. The audience's growing hostility had only made Michelle more confident in her performance. She clearly believed she was surrounded by people who had never experienced major disasters, who couldn't appreciate the delicate balance between emergency response and bureaucratic realities that separated professional disaster coordinators from amateur relief volunteers. Judge Judy had listened to Michelle's testimony with the patience of a predator waiting to strike. She had asked seemingly innocent questions about her disaster relief experience, her FEMA relationships, her understanding of emergency reconstruction standards. Michelle had answered with increasing confidence, clearly believing she was educating this television judge about the harsh realities of the disaster recovery industry. When Judge Judy had pressed her about the numerous complaints filed against her business by disaster victims and federal investigators, Michelle had made her fatal mistake that revealed the core of her predatory business model. Judge, with all due respect, you clearly don't understand disaster recovery logistics or the complexities of emergency construction management. Disaster victims become emotional when they realize that rebuilding from catastrophic loss requires time, patience, and significant financial resources that most families don't have readily available. Maybe if you understood FEMA procedures and storm damage assessment instead of just TV court, you'd see that I'm actually providing essential services to families who would be completely lost without professional disaster relief coordination. The words had barely finished leaving her mouth before she realized that something fundamental had shifted in the room. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity as Judge Judy's expression transformed from stern interest to barely contained fury. What Michelle didn't know was that Judge Judy's research team had conducted the most thorough disaster fraud investigation in the show's history. What Michelle didn't know was that they had contacted FEMA headquarters, spoken to dozens of her former victims, and uncovered a network of fraud so extensive that federal criminal authorities had already opened their own investigation. What Michelle didn't know was that questioning Judge Judy's understanding of disaster recovery was about to trigger the most devastating disaster exploitation exposure in courtroom television history. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Michelle Rodriguez sat in the defendant's chair with the composed posture of someone who had talked her way out of dozens of victim complaints and federal investigations. Her professional disaster relief uniform and emergency response credentials were carefully chosen props in her performance as the experienced coordinator dealing with unreasonable disaster victims. She had no idea that Judge Judy's folder contained evidence of crimes so extensive they would make her the most hated disaster exploiter in America. Behind her humanitarian confidence, cracks were already beginning to show as Judge Judy's questions became increasingly specific about her disaster response procedures and federal relief fund management. But Michelle's arrogance was too deeply ingrained for her to recognize the mortal danger she was in. This was supposed to be a simple construction contract dispute about unfinished disaster recovery work. Robert Chen was seeking $35,000 in damages after Michelle had collected his insurance settlement and FEMA relief funds while providing virtually no reconstruction services, leaving his family homeless and financially devastated 4 months after Hurricane Maria had already destroyed their lives once. Michelle had turned Robert's catastrophic loss into a source of easy money, exploiting his family's desperation and their lack of experience with disaster recovery procedures to steal federal relief funds while providing minimal reconstruction services. The fake emergency coordination had been just the beginning. She had also been filing fraudulent FEMA claims, stealing from disaster relief charities, and coordinating with corrupt contractors to maximize her profits while leaving families stranded in damaged homes. But this case represented something much larger than one family's stolen recovery funds. This was about trust, humanitarian exploitation, and what happens when someone with a sociopathic mind gains access to people's most desperate moments through the veneer of professional disaster relief services. Michelle had weaponized natural disasters themselves, turning families' catastrophic losses into opportunities for theft and fraud. The stakes couldn't have been higher for Robert and the hundreds of other families Michelle had victimized. Most were disaster survivors who had already lost their homes, their possessions, and sometimes their loved ones to natural catastrophes, only to have their recovery hopes destroyed by someone they trusted to help them rebuild their lives. What made this case truly explosive was what Michelle didn't know about Judge Judy's preparation. While Michelle had been expecting a routine television court appearance where she could play the role of the professional disaster responder dealing with an unreasonable victim, Judge Judy had been conducting an investigation that would make federal disaster fraud investigators proud. Phone calls to former victims revealed patterns of relief fund theft affecting hundreds of families across multiple disaster zones. FEMA records showed systematic fraud involving fake disaster claims and stolen relief funds that had been diverted from legitimate victims to Michelle's personal accounts. Most disturbing were the reports of families who had been left homeless and financially devastated after Michelle had stolen their insurance settlements and federal relief funds, leaving them worse off than immediately after their disasters. The audience sensed that something unprecedented was building. Regular Judge Judy viewers recognized the signs: the way she organized her papers when she had devastating evidence, the cold focus in her eyes when she encountered true predators. But this felt different, more systematic, more heartless than her usual takedowns of petty fraud cases. The woman sitting in the defendant's chair had no idea that she was about to be exposed as one of the most prolific disaster fraud criminals in recent television history. She had no idea that her crimes were about to be revealed to millions of viewers who would spend weeks sharing clips of her destruction across every social media platform, making her the most hated disaster exploiter in America. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold in that courtroom, you need to know exactly who these people were and what had brought them to this moment of disaster justice. Michelle, helping Michelle Rodriguez at 45 years old, had spent the better part of over a decade perfecting the art of disaster exploitation. Born Michelle Ann Santos in Miami, Florida, she had discovered early in life that disaster victims were incredibly vulnerable to anyone who appeared to offer professional relief coordination, and that vulnerability could be converted into massive profits with the right combination of humanitarian rhetoric and manufactured urgency. Her transformation into a professional disaster responder had begun 11 years ago, when she realized that natural disasters provided perfect cover for systematic fraud. Traumatized victims desperate for help, complex federal relief systems that people didn't understand, and the chaos of post-disaster recovery created an environment where systematic theft could be disguised as professional emergency services. The creation of emergency recovery solutions had been Michelle's masterpiece of humanitarian manipulation. She had developed an elaborate business facade complete with professional uniforms, fake FEMA relationships, and emergency response equipment that made her appear to be a legitimate disaster relief coordinator. Her operation generated millions in stolen relief funds annually, but the profits came not from helping families rebuild, but from systematically stealing federal assistance and insurance settlements while providing minimal actual recovery services. What made Michelle truly dangerous was her complete lack of conscience combined with an intuitive understanding of how disaster trauma affected decision-making. She had studied disaster psychology to better understand how to exploit victims during their most vulnerable post-catastrophe periods. She kept detailed databases of disaster zones, tracking federal relief allocations and insurance settlement patterns to identify the most profitable areas for her exploitation operations. Her method was always the same: monitor weather services and emergency broadcasts to identify major disasters, arrive in affected areas within 24 to 48 hours of catastrophic events, present herself as a professional disaster relief coordinator with FEMA connections, collect victims' insurance information and relief fund access, then systematically steal their recovery money while providing minimal reconstruction services. She had perfected the psychology of disaster fraud, understanding that families who had lost everything would trust anyone who appeared to offer professional help during their darkest hours. Michelle had built her empire by targeting the most vulnerable disaster victims: elderly homeowners with limited family support, low-income families without disaster experience, and communities where language barriers made it difficult for victims to navigate federal relief systems independently. She particularly exploited victims' desperation and their lack of knowledge about legitimate disaster recovery procedures, using their trauma and confusion to manipulate them into signing over control of their relief funds and insurance settlements. But Michelle's operation went far beyond simple contractor fraud. She had developed sophisticated schemes for filing fraudulent FEMA claims using stolen victim information, coordinating with corrupt insurance adjusters to inflate damage assessments, and partnering with illegitimate contractors who would perform minimal work while billing maximum rates. Her network included fake charities that she controlled, allowing her to steal private disaster donations as well as federal relief funds. The charity fraud operation had been particularly cruel and profitable. Michelle would establish fake disaster relief organizations immediately following major catastrophes, using legitimate-sounding names and professional websites to attract donations from people across the country who wanted to help disaster victims. These donations would be diverted to her personal accounts, while genuine disaster victims received nothing. Most disturbing was her systematic targeting of families who had lost loved ones in disasters. Michelle would identify bereaved families through obituaries and emergency response records, then approach them claiming that their deceased family members had signed up for emergency services before the disaster. She would use their grief and confusion to steal death benefits, life insurance payouts, and survivor relief funds that were meant to help families cope with their losses. Robert Chen represented everything that made Michelle's victims perfect targets. A hard-working immigrant family who had saved for years to buy their first home, only to lose everything to Hurricane Maria and desperately need professional help navigating the complex disaster recovery system. Robert worked as an engineer, and his wife Elena was a teacher, but neither had any experience with disaster recovery procedures or FEMA bureaucracy. When Hurricane Maria had devastated their Florida community, the Chen family had lost not just their home, but also most of their possessions, their cars, and Elena's classroom materials that she had spent years collecting. The emotional trauma of watching everything they had built together be destroyed in hours had been compounded by the overwhelming complexity of insurance claims, FEMA applications, and contractor estimates. Michelle had appeared at their FEMA Disaster Assistance Center within days of the hurricane, presenting herself as a coordinator who specialized in helping families navigate the recovery process efficiently. Her professional appearance, detailed knowledge of relief procedures, and urgent promises to help them access maximum assistance had convinced Robert and Elena that they had found exactly the advocate they desperately needed. The initial interactions had seemed perfectly legitimate. Michelle had helped them file FEMA applications, coordinated with insurance adjusters, and presented detailed reconstruction plans that appeared to maximize their recovery funds while minimizing their out-of-pocket expenses. Her professional contracts and emergency response credentials had convinced Robert's family that they were working with an experienced disaster professional who would help them rebuild their lives. But Robert's analytical nature, the same trait that made him an excellent engineer, had eventually led him to start questioning the lack of progress on their reconstruction and the constant requests for additional documentation and payments. When he had started calling FEMA and insurance companies directly, he had discovered that Michelle had been stealing their relief funds while providing virtually no actual reconstruction services. The devastating realization had come when Robert discovered that Michelle had diverted their $47,000 FEMA settlement and their $62,000 insurance payout to her personal accounts while subcontracting their minimal reconstruction work to unqualified day laborers who had left their home in worse condition than immediately after the hurricane. The family that had trusted Michelle to help them rebuild their lives had been left homeless and financially ruined by the person they had trusted most during their darkest hour. The discovery that Michelle had systematically stolen their disaster recovery funds while exploiting their trauma and desperation had given Robert the courage to fight back. His decision to take Michelle to Judge Judy represented not just his own quest for justice, but his determination to expose a predator who had been exploiting disaster victims for over a decade. Judge Judy Scheindlin, at 78 years old, had thought she had seen every type of fraud and exploitation in her decades on the bench. She had handled cases involving every form of deception that criminals use to victimize innocent people. But something about Michelle Rodriguez had triggered her most powerful instincts about truly despicable predators who exploited human tragedy for personal gain. What set this case apart for Judge Judy was the systematic nature of Michelle's operation and the devastating impact on hundreds of disaster victims whose recovery had been destroyed by someone they trusted to help them rebuild their lives. This wasn't opportunistic fraud or simple contractor negligence. It was the calculated exploitation of families' most catastrophic losses by someone who had turned natural disasters into profitable criminal opportunities. The criminal background investigation had revealed evidence that went far beyond simple contractor disputes. Federal relief fund theft involving systematic FEMA fraud, charity scams that had stolen millions in private donations, and a pattern of victim exploitation that had left hundreds of families worse off than immediately after their disasters. Most disturbing was evidence that Michelle had deliberately targeted the most vulnerable victims, elderly survivors, bereaved families, and immigrants who were least likely to understand their rights or report her crimes. Judge Judy had spent sleepless nights reviewing the evidence her team had gathered. FEMA records showing systematic fraud involving dozens of fake disaster claims filed using stolen victim information. Charity registration documents revealing that Michelle had established multiple fake relief organizations that existed only to steal donations. Bank records documenting the systematic theft of insurance settlements and federal relief funds that should have helped families rebuild their lives. The psychological profiles of Michelle's victims had been particularly disturbing to Judge Judy. Many families reported that their financial and emotional recovery from their disasters had been permanently damaged by Michelle's theft, with some never able to properly rebuild their homes or their lives. The compound trauma of losing everything to a natural disaster and then being victimized by someone they trusted for recovery assistance had required extensive counseling and support services that many families couldn't afford. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just disaster contractor fraud, but a comprehensive criminal enterprise that had perverted disaster relief systems while stealing hope from families who had already lost everything to natural catastrophes. Judge Judy had the evidence, the righteous fury, and the platform to deliver justice that had been too long delayed. Michelle had no idea that her years of hiding behind humanitarian rhetoric were about to end in the most public and devastating way possible. The opening moments of the case had played out exactly as Michelle expected. Judge Judy had reviewed the basic facts of the construction contract dispute, and Michelle had delivered what she believed was a flawless opening statement about the complexities of disaster recovery coordination and the challenges of helping families navigate federal relief systems. Her voice had carried the practiced authority of someone who had been giving similar explanations to federal investigators and devastated families for years. Your Honor, disaster recovery coordination is not like regular construction work. The Chen family experienced devastating losses during Hurricane Maria, and emergency recovery solutions provided critical emergency services during the most challenging period of their lives. When FEMA bureaucracy and insurance complications created delays, they became frustrated and unreasonable about timelines that were completely outside our control. Robert Chen's emotional testimony about his family's stolen recovery funds and continued homelessness seemed to bounce right off Michelle's armor of professional expertise. When Robert broke down describing how his children had been living in a FEMA trailer for months because Michelle had stolen their reconstruction money, Michelle actually looked sympathetic and made concerned notes in her disaster response clipboard, clearly performing the role of the caring coordinator dealing with an emotional victim who didn't understand disaster recovery realities. Judge Judy's initial questions had been deceptively gentle, almost conversational. She had asked Michelle about her disaster relief experience, her FEMA relationships, her understanding of federal recovery procedures. Michelle had answered with increasing confidence, clearly believing she was educating this television judge about the harsh realities of the disaster recovery industry. Your Honor, I've been coordinating disaster recovery efforts for 11 years because I have the expertise and federal relationships necessary to help families access maximum relief assistance. These disaster victims need professional guidance to navigate systems that would overwhelm them without expert coordination. The turning point came when Judge Judy pressed Michelle about her practice of collecting victims' insurance and FEMA funds up front while frequently experiencing bureaucratic delays that prevented completion of reconstruction work. Michelle's response revealed the predatory core of her business model and the calculated nature of her disaster exploitation operation. Judge, disaster recovery requires immediate access to relief funds to secure materials and coordinate emergency services before other contractors deplete available resources. When federal bureaucracy creates delays or insurance companies complicate settlements, professional disaster coordinators have the expertise and relationships to resolve problems that would leave families permanently displaced if handled by inexperienced victims. It was then that Judge Judy asked the question that would seal Michelle's fate. Ms. Rodriguez, in your 11 years of disaster relief coordination, what percentage of your clients have experienced significant delays or complications that prevented completion of their reconstruction work? Michelle's answer came with the confident authority of someone who believed her disaster expertise justified her methods. Judge, I'd say about 70% of disaster recovery cases involve some form of federal bureaucracy or insurance complication that requires professional intervention and additional time to resolve. Natural disasters create complex situations that separate experienced relief coordinators from well-meaning but inadequate volunteer efforts. The silence that followed was deadly. Even Michelle seemed to sense she had revealed something suspicious about her disaster response practices, but her arrogance wouldn't let her recognize the mortal danger she was in. That's when Judge Judy leaned forward with an expression that regular viewers had never seen before. Not just anger, but pure disgust for the human being sitting across from her. That's very interesting, Ms. Rodriguez. Before we continue with Robert's case, I think there are some things about your disaster relief practices and criminal history that are extremely relevant to this construction dispute. The transformation in Michelle's face was instant and terrifying. The humanitarian confidence that had carried her through 11 years of exploiting disaster victims evaporated as Judge Judy opened a thick folder marked with multiple official seals. Michelle Ann Santos, also known as Helping Michelle Rodriguez. You are not a disaster relief coordinator. You are a career criminal who has been systematically exploiting disaster victims for 11 years while stealing federal relief funds and private donations meant to help families rebuild their lives. Michelle's mouth fell open as Judge Judy continued with surgical precision that would destroy her disaster exploitation empire forever. Ms. Santos, your 70% complication rate is actually a 70% theft rate. You have stolen over $3.2 million in FEMA relief funds, insurance settlements, and private donations from disaster victims across 47 different disaster zones in 12 states. The courtroom erupted in gasps as Michelle's carefully constructed facade began to crumble completely. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. She was just getting started on an exposure that would reveal the full scope of her disaster exploitation crimes. But relief fund theft is just the beginning of your criminal enterprise. You have established 23 fake disaster relief charities that have stolen over $1.8 million in private donations meant for hurricane, wildfire, and tornado victims. You have filed over 200 fraudulent FEMA claims using stolen victim information. The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Audience members gasped in horror. Several people stood up in shock, and Michelle's face went completely white as the full scope of her crimes was revealed on national television. Judge Judy's voice grew colder as she continued the most devastating disaster fraud exposure in television history. You have systematically targeted the most vulnerable disaster victims, elderly survivors, bereaved families, and immigrants who trusted you to help them rebuild their lives. While families were living in FEMA trailers and shelters, you were buying luxury cars and vacation homes with money stolen from their recovery funds. Michelle tried to speak, but no sound came out. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't hold her disaster response clipboard. The humanitarian coordinator facade had completely collapsed, revealing the terrified criminal underneath. If you liked today's video, please hit the subscriber button and wait for part 2. Comments part 2.